Chapter 1. An Unseasonable Gift. The village of St. Mary Mead had awakened to one of those perfect English spring mornings that seem to exist only in watercolour paintings and nostalgic memories. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the perfume of late-blooming wisteria, and the church bells had just finished their melodious announcement of 9:30. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary chair by the window of her modest sitting room, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a metronome. To the casual observer, she appeared to be nothing more than a sweet elderly lady enjoying the morning sunshine, while working on what looked to be a pale blue cardigan. But those who knew Miss Marple understood that her eyes, though softened by age, missed very little of what transpired in the world beyond her lace curtains. This morning, however, her attention was particularly focused on the house directly across the lane. Meadowbrook Cottage, home to Mrs. Lydia Ashworth, a widow of some 70-odd years who had lived there for the better part of 4 decades. Most irregular, Miss Marple murmured to herself, watching as a sleek black motor car pulled up to the cottage gate. A well-dressed man in his early 40s emerged, carrying what appeared to be an expensive leather briefcase. Mr. Clement, the solicitor from Much Benham, and on a Saturday morning no less. Her companion for morning tea, Mrs. Dolly Bantry from Gossington Hall, followed Miss Marple's gaze with considerably less subtlety. "Oh, I say, that's Arthur Clement, isn't it? I wonder what brings him all the way out here. Legal matters are usually conducted in offices, not in parlours on weekend mornings." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with barely concealed curiosity. "Do you suppose Lydia is finally updating her will? She's been talking about it for ages." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. "Has she indeed? How very interesting. Oh yes, she mentioned it just last week at the vicarage garden party. Said something about making sure everything was in proper order. Of course, everyone assumes it will all go to young Philip, her nephew, you know. He's been absolutely devoted to her since his parents died in that dreadful accident 5 years ago." "Philip Ashworth," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Such a handsome young man. Works in London, doesn't he? Something in finance? Investment banking, I believe, though he comes down every other weekend to visit his aunt, sometimes more frequently." Mrs. Bantry helped herself to another biscuit. One could hardly ask for a more attentive nephew. Poor Lydia would be quite lost without him, especially since her health has been so uncertain this past year. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking steadily once more. "I hadn't realized Mrs. Ashworth was unwell. She seemed quite robust when I saw her at the greengrocer's last Tuesday." "Oh, she puts on a brave face, but I've heard from Mrs. Price, you know, the district nurse, that she's been having those dizzy spells again, and her heart isn't what it used to be." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Though between you and me, Jane, I think half her ailments are simply loneliness, rattling around in that big house all by herself, with only Mrs. Meeker coming in twice a week to clean." The solicitor remained inside Meadowbrook Cottage for precisely 47 minutes. Not that Miss Marple was actively timing his visit, but she happened to glance at the mantelpiece clock when he arrived, and again when he departed. When Mr. Clement finally emerged, he was accompanied not only by Mrs. Ashworth, but also by 2 other individuals who appeared to serve as witnesses, judging by the formal manner in which they shook hands at the door. "Well, that's that then," Mrs. Bantry declared. "She's gone and done it. Updated her will, as respectable people should. Though I must say it all seems rather sudden. Last week she was merely talking about it, and now it's already executed." Miss Marple set down her knitting and poured herself another cup of tea, her expression thoughtful. Human nature is endlessly fascinating, don't you think? The way people make decisions, the timing of their actions. There's always a reason, though it may not be immediately apparent. Really, Jane, you make it sound quite mysterious. It's simply a sensible woman putting her affairs in order. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed mildly. Though I do recall a situation many years ago in the village involving old Colonel Blythe. He suddenly updated his will, leaving everything to his young secretary rather than his daughter. Everyone thought it perfectly reasonable. The daughter had quarrelled with him after all, and the secretary had been most attentive. 3 weeks later, the colonel was dead. Mrs. Bantry's teacup clattered slightly in its saucer. Good heavens, Jane, surely you're not suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything at all, Miss Marple said serenely. I'm merely observing that the colonel's sudden generosity toward his secretary seemed less charitable when it was discovered that the young woman had been systematically poisoning him with arsenic from the garden shed. Fortunately, the doctor was astute enough to question the timing and order a post-mortem examination. How dreadful! Mrs. Bantry shuddered delicately. But that's hardly the same situation. Lydia Ashworth is leaving her estate to her nephew, not some scheming outsider. Blood is blood, after all. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes drifting back to the window. Though I've often found that the deepest betrayals come from those we trust most completely. The conversation moved on to safer topics. The upcoming church fete, Mrs. Hartnell's outrageous new hat, and the scandalous price of butter at the village shop. But some small nagging instinct at the back of Miss Marple's mind remained focused on Meadowbrook Cottage and its elderly occupant. It was precisely 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, when the village's tranquil routine was shattered by the sound of frantic ringing at Dr. Haydock's surgery door. Mrs. Meeker, the cleaning woman, stood on the doorstep in a state of near hysteria, her apron still tied around her waist. "It's Mrs. Ashworth," she gasped. "Oh, doctor, you must come at once. I found her collapsed in the drawing room, and she's not breathing properly, and oh, the poor dear lady." Dr. Haydock, a brisk, practical man in his late 50s, grabbed his medical bag and followed Mrs. Meeker at a run. But despite his swift response and best efforts, Lydia Ashworth was pronounced dead within the hour. The news spread through St. Mary Mead with the speed that only village gossip could achieve. By the time Miss Marple made her way to the village shop the following morning, the proprietress, Miss Hartnell, was already holding court with half a dozen customers clustered around the counter. Heart failure, Dr. Haydock said, not entirely unexpected at her age, and with her history of those dizzy spells. Miss Hartnell lowered her voice to a dramatic whisper. Poor Philip is absolutely devastated naturally. He drove down from London the moment he received the telegram. White as a sheet he was when I saw him going into the cottage this morning. How very sad, murmured Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife. And how fortunate that she had just put her affairs in order. At least Philip won't have any complications with the estate. Miss Marple, selecting a tin of biscuits with careful deliberation, spoke in her gentle, diffident manner. How convenient that the will was updated only last Saturday, almost as if she had a premonition. Miss Hartnell seized upon this observation with relish. Oh, but that's the most extraordinary part. According to young Timothy Wells, he works as a clerk in Mr. Clement's office, you know. The will wasn't merely updated. Mrs. Ashworth changed it completely. Everything goes to Philip Ashworth. But here's the peculiar bit. She also transferred the deed to the cottage into his name outright. Did it all at the same time as the will. Timothy said Mr. Clement thought it rather unusual, but Mrs. Ashworth insisted it would save on inheritance tax or some such financial matter. A small silence fell over the assembled customers. Even in a village accustomed to its share of gossip and intrigue, this information struck an odd note. So Philip Ashworth technically owned the cottage before his aunt died, Miss Marple said quietly, more to herself than to the others. How very unusual indeed. Mrs. Weatherby frowned. Is that quite proper? I mean, legally speaking. Perfectly legal, I should imagine, Miss Hartnell replied. Though I must admit, it does seem a trifle odd. Why not simply wait until the natural course of events? Miss Marple purchased her biscuits and a small bag of peppermints, thanked Miss Hartnell with her customary courtesy, and made her way slowly back to her cottage. Her mind, however, was working with considerably more speed than her careful steps suggested. That evening, after a simple supper of poached eggs and toast, Miss Marple sat once again by her window, her knitting lying idle in her lap. The lights were on in Meadowbrook Cottage, and she could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Philip Ashworth, no doubt, dealing with the melancholy business of funeral arrangements and estate matters. Most irregular, she murmured again, echoing her observation from 3 days earlier. One might almost say, convenient. Her mind drifted back through the years to another case, in another village where a nephew had been so very devoted to his wealthy uncle. Everyone had praised the young man's filial dedication, his weekly visits, his apparent concern for the old man's welfare. No one had thought to question why the uncle's health had begun to decline so precipitously, after the nephew had started bringing special tonics and supplements to build up his strength. Miss Marple's fingers absently stroked the soft wool of her knitting. Of course, that case had been entirely different. The uncle had been poisoned over several months, a slow and insidious process. Dr. Haydock had said heart failure in Mrs. Ashworth's case, which was perfectly plausible for a woman of her age and health history. And yet there was that timing. The sudden urgency to transfer property, the convenient completion of legal formalities mere days before an unexpected death. Miss Marple had lived long enough and observed human nature closely enough to know that remarkable coincidences, while they did occasionally occur, more often concealed something rather less innocent. Perhaps, she said aloud to her empty sitting room, it would be neighbourly to call upon Mr. Ashworth tomorrow. To offer my condolences, of course. One must observe the proper courtesies. The needles resumed their steady clicking, but Miss Marple's pale blue eyes remained thoughtful as she gazed out into the gathering darkness. In St. Mary Mead, as in every village she had ever known, the surface of daily life was often smooth and placid. But underneath that calm exterior, currents of passion, greed, and desperation flowed with surprising strength. And sometimes, those currents led to murder. Chapter 2. Condolences and Curiosities. The following afternoon arrived with a thin drizzle that seemed to match the sombre mood settling over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple selected a modest black hat from her wardrobe, pinned it carefully into place, and took up the basket she had prepared earlier. A selection of her homemade scones, a small pot of strawberry jam, and some early roses from her garden, their petals barely beginning to unfurl. The walk to Meadowbrook Cottage took less than 5 minutes, but Miss Marple moved with deliberate slowness, her observant eyes taking in every detail of the house as she approached. The curtains in the front windows had been drawn as a mark of respect, though she noticed that the study window at the side of the house remained uncovered, and through it she could glimpse Philip Ashworth seated at his late aunt's mahogany desk, apparently absorbed in paperwork. She rang the bell and waited, adjusting the basket on her arm. The door was opened not by Philip himself, but by a young woman Miss Marple didn't immediately recognize. She was perhaps 30 years old, with sharp, intelligent features and auburn hair pulled back in a practical chignon. Her black dress was expensive but understated, and she wore a single strand of pearls that caught the grey afternoon light. "Yes." The woman's tone was polite but guarded. "I do hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said with her gentlest smile. "I'm Miss Marple, from across the lane. I wish to offer my condolences to Mr. Ashworth, and thought perhaps these small tokens might provide some comfort." She indicated the basket. The young woman's expression softened marginally. "How kind. I'm Veronica Ashworth, Philip's wife. Do come in, Miss Marple. Philip is in the study, but I'm sure he'll want to thank you personally." Wife. Miss Marple filed this information away with interest. She had not known that Philip Ashworth was married, though of course there was no reason she should have known. The young man's visits to his aunt had apparently been solitary affairs. The interior of Meadowbrook Cottage was much as Miss Marple remembered from a tea party several years earlier, comfortable, slightly old-fashioned, filled with the accumulated possessions of a long life. Photographs crowded the mantelpiece, and the furniture bore the soft patina of age and careful maintenance. Yet something felt different now, though Miss Marple couldn't immediately identify what had changed. Veronica Ashworth led her through to the drawing room, where a tea service had been set out on a low table. "Please, do sit down. I'll fetch Philip." Left alone for a moment, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to travel around the room. The photographs on the mantelpiece showed Mrs. Ashworth at various stages of her life: her wedding day, holidays abroad, and numerous pictures of a young boy who grew progressively older through the years. Philip, presumably, from childhood through to young manhood. But it was the more recent photographs that caught Miss Marple's attention. Several showed Philip with his aunt, both smiling at the camera. But the warmth in these images seemed somehow staged, the smiles not quite reaching their eyes. In one photograph, Mrs. Ashworth appeared to be pulling slightly away from her nephew's embrace, a gesture so subtle that most people would never notice it. "Miss Marple, how very thoughtful of you to call." She turned to find Philip Ashworth entering the room, his wife just behind him. He was indeed handsome, with the sort of classical features that photographed well. Strong jaw, clear grey eyes, dark hair showing the first distinguished threads of silver at the temples. His grief appeared genuine, evident in the shadows beneath his eyes, and the slight dishevelment of his usually impeccable appearance. "Mr. Ashworth, please accept my deepest sympathies. Your aunt was a remarkable woman. Thank you." He gestured for her to sit, then settled himself in the chair opposite, while Veronica positioned herself on the sofa, her posture perfect, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Aunt Lydia spoke of you occasionally. She said you had the sharpest eyes in the village." "Did she?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. "I'm afraid I merely noticed things that happened to be there. Your aunt was always very kind to me." Veronica poured the tea with practiced grace, passing cups around with the efficiency of one accustomed to social rituals. It must have been a comfort to her, having such observant neighbours. This is rather an isolated house, isn't it? Set back from the main road, screened by those large hedges. Mrs. Ashworth valued her privacy, Miss Marple said, accepting her teacup. "Though I believe Mrs. Meeker, the cleaning woman, came regularly?" "Twice weekly," Philip confirmed. "Tuesday and Friday mornings. She was the one who found Aunt Lydia." his voice caught slightly. "If only I had been here. I had planned to visit this past weekend, but business kept me in London." "These things are sent to try us," Miss Marple said gently, "though I understand the timing must make it particularly difficult. Having just seen your aunt the previous Saturday for the legal arrangements," she let the sentence trail off, watching both husband and wife carefully. Philip's expression remained sorrowful, but composed. Veronica, however, set down her teacup with just enough force to make it rattle in its saucer. "The legal arrangements were Aunt Lydia's idea entirely," Veronica said, her voice suddenly sharp. "Philip would never have asked, but she insisted on transferring the property immediately. Something about wanting to see it settled before anything happened to her." "Almost as if she anticipated something," Miss Marple observed quietly. Philip leaned forward, his grey eyes intent. Dr. Haydock had warned her that her heart was weak. "I think she simply wanted to spare me the complications of probate. She was always so thoughtful, always putting others first." "She must have trusted you enormously," Miss Marple said. "To make such arrangements requires complete faith in one's heir." Something flickered across Philip's face. Was it guilt? Satisfaction? Triumph? It passed too quickly for Miss Marple to be certain. But Veronica's reaction was clearer. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened until the knuckles showed white against her skin. "Philip was devoted to his aunt," Veronica said, and there was something cold in her tone now, something almost defensive. "He visited regularly, managed her, financial affairs, ensured she wanted for nothing. No one could have done more. I'm quite sure," Miss Marple agreed. She sipped her tea, then set down the cup. "Forgive me for asking, but had Mrs. Ashworth been feeling unwell in the days before her death? I only ask because I thought I saw Dr. Haydock's motor car outside the cottage last Monday evening." The silence that followed was profound. Philip and Veronica exchanged a glance, brief but loaded with meaning. "Dr. Haydock," Philip said finally. "No, I don't think he was here Monday. Aunt Lydia hadn't mentioned feeling poorly when I spoke to her on the telephone that day." "My mistake," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "At my age, one's memory can play tricks. Perhaps it was another house entirely." But it hadn't been a mistake. Miss Marple's memory was as sharp as ever, and she had distinctly seen Dr. Haydock's distinctive green Morris entering the Meadowbrook Cottage Drive on Monday evening, remaining for approximately 20 minutes before departing. And now Philip Ashworth had just lied to her about it. The question was, why? She rose, gathering her gloves and handbag. "I won't intrude further. Please do let me know if there's anything I can do to help with the arrangements." Philip escorted her to the door, his manner once again perfectly courteous. But as Miss Marple stepped out into the drizzle, she glanced back and caught Veronica Ashworth standing at the drawing-room window, staring after her with an expression that was distinctly troubled. Walking slowly back to her own cottage, Miss Marple's mind worked methodically through what she had learned. A nephew who had inherited before the death. A wife who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. A doctor's visit that had been deliberately concealed. And beneath it all, that persistent nagging sense that something was profoundly wrong. "Human nature," she murmured to herself, opening her garden gate. "Always so revealing, even when one tries to hide it." Chapter 3. The Doctor's Dilemma. Dr. Haydock was not a man who enjoyed being questioned about his patients, living or deceased. This was a principle he had maintained throughout his 30 years of practice in St. Mary Mead. and he had no intention of abandoning it now, even when confronted with Miss Marple's sweetest smile over a chance encounter outside the chemist's shop the following morning. "Lovely weather we're having now that the rain has cleared," Miss Marple remarked, adjusting her shopping basket. "Though I suppose in your profession, Doctor, you're obliged to venture out in all conditions. I noticed you were making calls rather late on Monday evening." Dr. Haydock, a tall man with iron-grey hair and a naturally brusque manner, paused in the act of lighting his pipe. His keen eyes studied Miss Marple with the same clinical attention he might give to an interesting set of symptoms. "Monday evening," he repeated neutrally. "Yes, I happened to be closing my curtains. Oh, it must have been around 7 o'clock, and I saw your motor car. The green Morris is quite distinctive, you know. I believe you were visiting Meadowbrook Cottage, though of course I may be mistaken." She smiled innocently. One doesn't like to pry, but given what happened to poor Mrs. Ashworth just the next day, I wondered if perhaps she'd been feeling unwell. The doctor's expression remained carefully controlled, but Miss Marple, who had known him for many years, detected a certain tension in the set of his shoulders. He drew on his pipe before answering. "Mrs. Ashworth's death was due to heart failure, as I stated on the death certificate. Natural causes, Miss Marple. Tragic but entirely expected given her medical history." "Oh, I'm not questioning your professional judgment, Doctor. Heaven forbid. I merely thought, well, if she had summoned you the evening before, it might indicate that she had some warning, some sense that something was wrong." Dr. Haydock's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Ashworth did not summon me on Monday evening." The words hung in the air between them, laden with significance. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her expression one of gentle confusion. "But if she didn't summon you, then why?" She stopped herself, as if suddenly aware of overstepping. "I do apologize. As you say, it's none of my concern." "Indeed." The doctor's tone was firm, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker of worry, perhaps, or uncertainty. He touched his hat. "Good day, Miss Marple." She watched him stride away toward his surgery, his pipe trailing smoke, and reflected that the conversation had been most illuminating. Dr. Haydock had not denied being at Meadowbrook Cottage. He had simply stated that Mrs. Ashworth hadn't summoned him. Which raised the obvious question: if the patient hadn't requested a visit, who had? That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself taking tea with Mrs. Price, the district nurse, in the latter's neat cottage at the far end of the village. Mrs. Price was a sensible, practical woman in her early 50s, blessed with both discretion and a genuine concern for her patients. She was also, Miss Marple had observed over the years, someone who noticed a great deal in the course of her professional duties. "Such a shock about Mrs. Ashworth," Mrs. Price said, pouring tea from a sturdy brown pot. "Though between ourselves, Miss Marple, I wasn't entirely surprised. Her heart had been deteriorating for some months. Had she been in pain? Experiencing significant symptoms?" Mrs. Price hesitated, the teapot hovering over Miss Marple's cup. "That's the curious thing. When I last visited her, that would be about 3 weeks ago, she seemed in quite reasonable health. Better than I'd seen her in some time, actually. She mentioned that her nephew had brought her some new tonic from London, something recommended by a Harley Street specialist. Said it was working wonders." Miss Marple accepted her tea with a murmured thanks. "A tonic? How interesting. What sort of tonic? I'm afraid I don't know the particulars. She showed me the bottle. Dark glass, rather elegant label, but I didn't examine it closely. It wasn't prescribed by Dr. Haydock, but that's not unusual. London specialists often recommend specialized preparations. Mrs. Price frowned slightly. Though I will say, it seemed odd that she'd improved so much, and then deteriorated so rapidly. Did Dr. Haydock know about this tonic? I couldn't say. Mrs. Ashworth was rather proud of managing her own health affairs. She didn't always share everything with the doctor. Mrs. Price lowered her voice. To be honest, I think there was some tension between them. Dr. Haydock can be rather domineering, and Mrs. Ashworth valued her independence. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. A tonic from London, unexplained improvement followed by sudden death, and a doctor who had made an unsolicited visit the evening before the patient died. The pattern was beginning to take shape, like a tapestry revealing its design as more threads were woven into place. I don't suppose, she ventured carefully, that you know what became of this tonic, whether it's still at the cottage? Mrs. Price shook her head. I imagine Mr. Ashworth has begun clearing out his aunt's medications. Natural thing to do, isn't it? No point keeping bottles of pills and potions once someone has passed. Natural indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Though in her experience, the swift disposal of medications after an unexpected death could be rather more significant than mere tidiness. Their conversation drifted to other topics. The upcoming church bazaar, the scandalous state of the village hall roof, the various minor ailments afflicting the elderly population of St. Mary Mead. But when Miss Marple finally took her leave, her mind was far from these mundane concerns. She walked slowly back through the village, past the church with its ancient yew trees, past the post office where Miss Hartnell was holding forth to an audience of shoppers, past the village green where children played in the late afternoon sunshine. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, reassuringly ordinary. Yet beneath this placid surface, Miss Marple sensed something deeply wrong. A nephew who had arranged to inherit property before his aunt's death. A mysterious tonic that had first improved and then apparently failed to prevent a fatal heart attack. A doctor making an unexplained visit hours before his patient died. And somewhere in all of this, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. As she approached her own gate, she noticed a figure standing near Meadowbrook Cottage. Veronica Ashworth, dressed in black, speaking intently with someone in a dark motor car. The conversation appeared heated, Veronica's gestures sharp and emphatic. Then the car pulled away, driving quickly past Miss Marple without slowing. She caught only a glimpse of the driver, a man, middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit and a degaged expression of considerable displeasure. Veronica Ashworth remained on the pavement, staring after the retreating vehicle. When she finally turned and saw Miss Marple watching, her face flushed dark red. For a moment, their eyes met across the narrow lane. Then Veronica hurried back into the cottage, slamming the door with enough force to be heard clearly in the quiet afternoon air. Miss Marple entered her own home, removed her hat and gloves and settled into her chair by the window. Her knitting lay waiting, but for once she ignored it, her attention fixed on the house across the way. Most revealing, she murmured. Most revealing indeed. Somewhere in Meadowbrook Cottage, among the photographs and furniture and carefully ordered possessions of a dead woman's life, lay the answer to a question that was becoming increasingly urgent. Had Lydia Ashworth died of natural causes, or had someone helped her along to an early grave? And if so, who stood to benefit most from her untimely death? Chapter 4. Whispers at the Vicarage. The funeral of Lydia Ashworth took place on Friday morning, under appropriately grey skies that threatened rain but never quite delivered. Miss Marple attended, as did most of the village, for Mrs. Ashworth had been a respected member of the community for over 40 years, and St. Mary Mead took its social obligations seriously. The church was filled with the scent of lilies and the hushed murmur of sombre voices. Miss Marple positioned herself in a pew near the back, from which vantage point she could observe the assembled mourners without appearing to do so. Philip Ashworth sat in the front pew, his wife Veronica beside him, both dressed in appropriate black. Philip's grief seemed genuine. His shoulders were bowed, and he dabbed occasionally at his eyes with a handkerchief. Veronica, by contrast, sat rigid and upright, her face a composed mask that revealed nothing. But it was the other attendees who captured Miss Marple's particular attention. Dr. Haydock sat near the middle of the church, his expression grimmer than usual. 2 rows behind him, a distinguished-looking gentleman in his late 50s kept glancing toward the front pew with an intensity that seemed more than casual sympathy. And near the side aisle, Mrs. Meeker, the cleaning woman, wept openly into a worn handkerchief, her distress appearing far more profound than one might expect from someone employed merely twice weekly. The service concluded with the vicar's usual eloquent remarks about mortality and eternal rest. As the congregation filed out into the churchyard, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Colonel Melchett, the chief constable who had known Mrs. Ashworth through various village committees. "Sad business," the colonel remarked, adjusting his hat against the threatening drizzle, "though I understand it was entirely expected. Heart condition, wasn't it?" "So Dr. Haydock has stated," Miss Marple replied, "though one does wonder about the timing." Colonel Melchett gave her a sharp look. "The timing? What do you mean?" "Simply that Mrs. Ashworth executed a new will and transferred property to her nephew just days before her death. One might almost think she had a premonition." "Nothing sinister in that, surely. Sensible woman putting her affairs in order, knowing her health was precarious." But the colonel's tone had become slightly defensive, as if he sensed criticism of his jurisdiction. Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. "Oh, I'm certain you're quite right, Colonel. I simply have a curious mind, I'm afraid. One of the burdens of old age, too much time for contemplation." She moved away before he could respond, making her way toward the vicarage, where refreshments were being served for the mourners. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Weatherby, presided over the tea urn with her customary efficiency, while various villagers clustered in small groups, their voices appropriately subdued. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and positioned herself near the window, where she could observe without being obviously intrusive. Philip Ashworth stood near the fireplace, accepting condolences from a steady stream of well-wishers. His responses were measured and appropriate, his grief seemingly sincere. Veronica remained at his side, but Miss Marple noticed that husband and wife rarely looked at each other, and when they did, the glances were weighted with something that resembled tension rather than mutual support. "Such a devoted nephew," Miss Hartnell pronounced, materializing at Miss Marple's elbow with a plate of sandwiches. "One couldn't ask for better. Why, he visited his aunt at least twice a month, sometimes more frequently." "Did he indeed? I had thought it was every other weekend." Miss Hartnell's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of possessing superior knowledge. "Well, that's what everyone assumed. But Mrs. Meeker mentioned to me just yesterday that she'd often seen his motor car in the drive on unexpected days, sometimes staying quite late into the evening." "How very devoted," Miss Marple murmured. "And Mrs. Ashworth, was she always pleased to see him?" "What a strange question. Of course she was. What aunt wouldn't be delighted by such attention?" But Miss Hartnell's confident tone wavered slightly. "Though now you mention it, Mrs. Meeker did say that on one occasion, it must have been about 2 months ago, she overheard raised voices. Mrs. Ashworth saying something about not being pressured, and Philip's voice rather sharp in response. But then families do have their disagreements, don't they? Before Miss Marple could pursue this intriguing revelation, she noticed the distinguished gentleman she'd observed in church making his way purposefully toward Philip Ashworth. The man's expression was stern, almost accusatory, and several nearby mourners fell silent as he approached. "Mr. Ashworth," the gentleman said, his voice carrying across the room despite its measured tone. "Gerald Pemberton, I was your aunt's solicitor for over 20 years, until last month when she rather abruptly terminated my services." The room had grown noticeably quieter. Philip Ashworth's face flushed, but he extended his hand with apparent cordiality. "Mr. Pemberton, yes, Aunt Lydia mentioned the change. I believe she felt Mr. Clement's firm offered certain tax advantages." Indeed, Pemberton's tone was frigid. Though I found it remarkable that she would make such a significant change after all these years, particularly regarding estate planning, without consulting me first. Even more remarkable that the new will should be executed with such unusual haste. I fail to see what business this is of yours, now that you're no longer her solicitor. This from Veronica Ashworth, who had stepped forward, her voice sharp with hostility. Pemberton turned his cold gaze upon her. "It becomes my business, Mrs. Ashworth, when I receive a letter from my former client dated the day before she died, expressing certain concerns about recent events, and asking me to visit her at my earliest convenience. A visit I was, unfortunately, unable to make due to being in London on business, a delay I now deeply regret." The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple set down her teacup with exquisite care, her attention wholly focused on the scene unfolding before her. Philip Ashworth had gone very pale. "A letter? What sort of concerns?" "That," Pemberton said deliberately, "is a matter I intend to discuss with the police. I felt it only proper to inform you of my intentions first, out of respect for your late aunt's memory." He inclined his head stiffly. "Good day." He strode from the room, leaving a wake of shocked whispers behind him. Philip stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides. Veronica gripped his arm, her knuckles white with the force of her hold, and across the room, Dr. Haydock met Miss Marple's eyes with an expression that confirmed her growing suspicions. Something was indeed very wrong with Lydia Ashworth's death. Mrs. Weatherby rushed forward with flustered attempts to restore normalcy, pressing more tea and sandwiches upon guests who had suddenly lost their appetites. The gathering began to break up, mourners making hasty excuses to depart. Miss Marple remained by the window, watching as Philip and Veronica left without another word to anyone, their departure swift and their bearing defensive. When the vicarage had finally cleared, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Weatherby, who was stacking cups with trembling hands. "Most distressing," the vicar's wife said, "to suggest impropriety at a funeral gathering. Whatever can Mr. Pemberton have been thinking?" "I suspect," Miss Marple said gently, "that he was thinking about his duty to a client who may have died before she could reveal something of considerable importance." Mrs. Weatherby stared at her. "Surely you don't mean, Miss Marple, you cannot seriously suggest that Mrs. Ashworth's death was anything other than natural?" Miss Marple collected her handbag and gloves. "I suggest nothing, but I observe a great deal, and what I observe is a pattern of behaviour that reminds me very much of a case in Much Benham some years ago, involving an elderly gentleman and his very attentive godson." "What happened in that case?" "The godson was hanged for murder," Miss Marple said quietly. "The poison was administered gradually over several months, disguised as a beneficial tonic. By the time anyone thought to question the death, the evidence had been disposed of, and the godson had inherited a considerable fortune. She left Mrs. Weatherby staring after her in horror, and made her way slowly back through the village. The drizzle had finally begun in earnest, and Miss Marple opened her umbrella, her mind working methodically through the pieces of this increasingly complex puzzle. A letter expressing concerns. A solicitor abruptly dismissed and replaced. Property transferred before death. A mysterious tonic. And somewhere in all of this, the truth waiting to be discovered. Chapter 5. The Cleaning Woman's Tale. Saturday morning brought genuine sunshine to St. Mary Mead, the sort of clear bright day that made the events of the previous week seem almost unreal. Miss Marple spent the early hours tending to her garden, deadheading roses and pulling the occasional weed, though her mind was far from horticultural concerns. She had just returned inside to wash her hands when she noticed Mrs. Meeker walking past her gate, moving with the slow, heavy tread of someone carrying an invisible burden. "Mrs. Meeker," Miss Marple called from her doorway. "What fortunate timing! I've just put the kettle on. Would you join me for a cup of tea?" The cleaning woman paused, her worn face showing surprise and a flicker of something that might have been relief. "That's very kind of you, Miss Marple. I don't want to impose. Nonsense. I would welcome the company." Miss Marple held the door open invitingly. "And I've been meaning to express my condolences. I know you were devoted to Mrs. Ashworth." Mrs. Meeker's eyes immediately filled with tears. She fumbled for her handkerchief as she entered the cottage, and Miss Marple guided her gently to the sitting room, settling her in the most comfortable chair before hurrying to prepare the tea. When she returned with the tray, Mrs. Meeker had composed herself somewhat, though her distress remained evident. "I'm sorry for being so emotional," the woman said, accepting her cup with trembling hands. "It's just that Mrs. Ashworth was more than an employer to me. She was kind when my husband died, helped with the funeral expenses and such. Not many would do that for a cleaning woman." "She was clearly a generous soul," Miss Marple said warmly. "You must have known her very well, having worked for her these past how many years?" 15 years come this August, twice a week, regular as clockwork, Tuesdays and Fridays." Mrs. Meeker sipped her tea, then set the cup down with a sudden determination. "Miss Marple, I need to talk to someone, and you've always struck me as a sensible lady who doesn't gossip for the sake of it." "I hope I can be trusted with confidences," Miss Marple said quietly. Mrs. Meeker leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper despite their privacy. "Something wasn't right these past few months. I can't explain it exactly, but Mrs. Ashworth changed. She became nervous, jumpy-like, and there were arguments. I heard them, even though they tried to keep their voices down when I was there. Arguments with her nephew? With Mr. Philip, yes. The first time was back in March. I was cleaning the upstairs landing, and they were in the study below. The door wasn't quite closed, and voices carry in that house. Mr. Philip was saying something about market opportunities and windows closing, and Mrs. Ashworth said, I remember this clearly. She said, I won't be pressured, Philip. This is my home and my decision to make. Miss Marple poured more tea, her expression encouraging but not pressing. Mrs. Meeker continued, the words now flowing more freely as if a dam had broken. After that, Mr. Philip started visiting more frequently. Sometimes twice a week, sometimes more. He'd bring these bottles of medicine, special tonics he said came from London doctors. Mrs. Ashworth started taking them regular-like. Mrs. Meeker's voice caught. And that's when she started getting those dizzy spells. She hadn't experienced them before the tonic. Never. Oh, she had her heart condition, had it for years, but it was stable. Dr. Haydock had her on medication that seemed to manage it well enough, but after she started taking that tonic from London, Mrs. Meeker shook her head. She'd be fine one day, then weak and dizzy the next. I suggested she stop taking it, but she said Mr. Philip had paid a great deal for it, and she didn't want to seem ungrateful. Miss Marple's needles had begun their steady clicking, though her attention never wavered from her visitor. Did Dr. Haydock know about these tonics? That's just it. I don't think he did, not at first. But the Monday before she died, Mrs. Ashworth had one of her worst spells. I wasn't there, but she told me about it when I came on Friday. She said she'd been so frightened that she'd telephoned Dr. Haydock, asked him to come that evening. Said she'd finally told him about the tonic. And what was his reaction? Mrs. Meeker's hands twisted the handkerchief in her lap. She said he was very concerned. Asked to see the bottle, examined it closely, even took a small sample away with him. Told her to stop taking it immediately until he could have it analyzed. He said something about the ingredients being wrong, or the proportions being dangerous for someone with her condition. The clicking of Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment before resuming. I see. And did Mrs. Ashworth stop taking the tonic? She said she would, but the very next day, Mrs. Meeker's voice broke. The very next day, I found her collapsed in the drawing room. The bottle of tonic was on the side table, and there was a glass beside it, half empty. She'd taken another dose that morning. You're quite certain of this? As certain as I'm sitting here. I saw the glass, saw the bottle, and when Dr. Haydock arrived, I mentioned it to him. He went very still, very quiet. Asked me where the bottle was, but I'd already given it to Mr. Philip. He'd arrived just minutes before the doctor, and when he saw his aunt collapsed, he gathered up all her medications, said something about putting them away properly. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Mrs. Meeker, have you told anyone else about this? The police, perhaps? The cleaning woman shook her head miserably. Who'd believe me? I'm just a cleaning woman. And Mr. Philip is a fine gentleman from London. Besides, Dr. Haydock signed the death certificate saying it was heart failure. Natural causes. But Miss Marple... She looked up with anguished eyes. What if it wasn't natural? What if that tonic was hurting her all along, and that last dose... She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Miss Marple understood perfectly well what she was suggesting. Mrs. Meeker, I want you to think very carefully. Did you notice anything else unusual in those final weeks? Any other visitors? Any changes in Mrs. Ashworth's routine or behavior? The woman considered, her brow furrowed with concentration. There was one thing, now you mention it. About 3 weeks before she died, Mrs. Ashworth went to see Mr. Pemberton, her old solicitor, the one she'd had for years. She didn't tell Mr. Philip about it, I'm certain of that. She asked me to post a letter for her, and I saw it was addressed to Mr. Pemberton's office. Then, a few days later, she had me telephone his office to make an appointment. She seemed quite determined about it. But she never kept that appointment. She did, actually. Took a taxi into Much Benham on a Friday when Mr. Philip was in London. When she came back, she seemed, I don't know how to describe it. Relieved, maybe, but also frightened. That same evening, Mr. Philip arrived unexpectedly. He wasn't supposed to visit until the weekend. They had another argument, a bad one. I was just leaving, and I heard Mrs. Ashworth say, It's done, Philip. I've made my decision, and there's nothing you can do to change it. And yet, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, The following Saturday, she executed a new will with Mr. Clement and transferred the property to Philip. Rather a significant reversal of position, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Meeker's face crumpled. "I didn't know about that until after she died. If I had known, Miss Marple, do you think something wrong happened? Do you think someone—" She couldn't voice the terrible suspicion aloud. Miss Marple reached over and patted the woman's hand gently. "I think, my dear, that there are several questions that require answers, and I believe it's time those answers were sought by the proper authorities." She paused. "Mrs. Meeker, would you be willing to speak with Colonel Melchett, to tell him everything you've told me?" The cleaning woman's face showed fear, but also a growing determination. "If it means finding out the truth about what happened to Mrs. Ashworth, then yes, she deserves that much. She deserves justice." "Indeed she does," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "Indeed she does." Chapter 6. The letter from the dead Colonel Melchett received Miss Marple and Mrs. Meeker in his study at Gossington Hall that same afternoon. The chief constable was a man who prided himself on his practical, no-nonsense approach to life, and he listened to Mrs. Meeker's account with growing concern, his bushy eyebrows drawing together in a formidable frown. "This is a serious allegation, Mrs. Meeker," he said when she had finished. "You're suggesting that Mrs. Ashworth may have been poisoned by her own nephew." "I'm not suggesting anything, sir," Mrs. Meeker replied, her voice trembling but steady. "I'm only telling you what I saw and heard. It's for cleverer people than me to decide what it means." Colonel Melchett turned to Miss Marple, who sat quietly in her chair, her hands folded over her handbag. "And you, Miss Marple? What's your assessment of this situation?" "I think, Colonel, that there are too many inconsistencies to be ignored. A woman who visits her long-time solicitor with apparent urgency, who then reverses her intentions completely within days. A beneficial tonic that seems to cause more harm than good. A doctor who expresses concern about medication and removes a sample for analysis, only to sign a death certificate citing natural causes the very next day." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her words carried weight. "And most significantly, a letter from the deceased expressing concerns to her former solicitor. A letter that arrived too late for action to be taken." "Ah, yes, Pemberton's letter." The colonel reached for a file on his desk. "He brought it to me yesterday, along with some rather disturbing information about the circumstances of Mrs. Ashworth's will change. I've been considering whether there's sufficient cause to investigate further." "May I ask what the letter contained?" Miss Marple inquired. Colonel Melchett hesitated, then appeared to make a decision. "I suppose there's no harm in telling you, given that you'll likely deduce it anyway. Mrs. Ashworth wrote that she had made a terrible error in judgment, that she had been persuaded to take actions she now regretted, and that she feared her nephew's interest in her estate had overridden his genuine concern for her welfare. She asked Pemberton to visit her urgently to discuss reversing the property transfer and creating a new will." The room fell silent. Mrs. Meeker had gone very pale, while Miss Marple nodded slowly as if this confirmation matched her expectations. "She realized too late," the cleaning woman whispered. "Poor lady! She realized what was happening and tried to stop it." "We don't know that for certain," Colonel Melchett cautioned, though his tone suggested he shared their suspicions. "However, I've taken the liberty of asking Dr. Haydock to call this afternoon. I think it's time we had some frank answers from him." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Dr. Haydock was announced by the butler. The doctor entered with his characteristic briskness, but Miss Marple noticed the tension in his bearing, the shadows beneath his eyes that suggested sleepless nights. Melchett, he greeted the colonel curtly, then nodded to the ladies. Miss Marple, Mrs. Meeker. Thank you for coming, Doctor. Please, sit down. Colonel Melchett gestured to a chair. We need to discuss Lydia Ashworth's death, and I believe you have information that you've been reluctant to share. Dr. Haydock's jaw tightened. My patient's medical information is confidential, even after death. Not when murder is suspected. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Dr. Haydock's face flushed, then went pale. He sank into the offered chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. You suspected it too, Miss Marple said quietly. That's why you went to see Mrs. Ashworth on Monday evening. That's why you took a sample of the tonic for analysis. The doctor's shoulders sagged in defeat. Yes, God help me, yes. Mrs. Ashworth telephoned me in a state of considerable distress. She said she'd been feeling increasingly unwell despite, or rather because of, a tonic her nephew had been providing. She'd finally read the label carefully and realized it contained digitalis in significant quantities. Digitalis? Colonel Melchett leaned forward sharply. A heart medication derived from foxglove. In proper doses, it strengthens the heart. In excessive amounts, especially combined with the medication I had already prescribed for Mrs. Ashworth's condition, it can be fatal. Dr. Haydock's voice was heavy with guilt. I examined the bottle. The concentration was far too high for someone with her medical history. Combined with her regular medication, she was essentially being poisoned gradually. Each dose would have made her weaker, more susceptible to heart failure. Why didn't you report this immediately? Colonel Melchett demanded. Because I had no proof of intent. The label claimed it was a proprietary blend from a private Harley Street practice. It could have been an honest error, a pharmacy mistake, a mislabeling, a misunderstanding about proper dosage. I told Mrs. Ashworth to stop taking it immediately. I took a sample to send for independent analysis, to verify my concerns before making accusations that could destroy a man's reputation. But she died before you could complete the analysis, Miss Marple said. Dr. Haydock nodded miserably. When I was called to attend her the next evening, I found her collapsed, clearly suffering from acute digitalis toxicity. The symptoms were unmistakable. The vomiting, the irregular heartbeat, the confusion. But by then it was too late. Her heart gave out before I could do anything to save her. And yet you signed a death certificate citing natural causes, Colonel Melchett said, his voice hard. Because that's what it was, technically. Her heart failed due to an existing condition exacerbated by medication. I had no proof that the tonic had been deliberately prepared to harm her. No proof that Philip Ashworth knew about the dangerous concentration. No proof of anything except an old woman's death from heart failure. The doctor's voice cracked, but I've barely slept since. Because in my heart I know she was murdered as surely as if someone had put a pillow over her face. Mrs. Meeker was weeping quietly. Miss Marple handed her a clean handkerchief, her own expression grave but unsurprised. There's more, isn't there, Doctor? Miss Marple asked gently. Something you observed when you arrived that evening. Dr. Haydock looked at her with something approaching admiration, mixed with despair. You don't miss much, do you, Miss Marple? Yes, there was something. When I arrived, Philip Ashworth was already there. He claimed he'd just come down from London on impulse to surprise his aunt, but his motorcar engine was completely cold. He'd been there for hours, not minutes, and I saw him carrying a tray out of the drawing room, a teacup, a plate, and the bottle of tonic. He said he was tidying up, but you think he'd prepared that final fatal dose himself, Colonel Melchett finished, perhaps even administered it personally. I think, Dr. Haydock said slowly, that when Mrs. Ashworth wrote to Pemberton, Philip somehow discovered it. I think he realized his aunt was going to reverse everything, the property transfer, the new will, all of it. And I think he decided he couldn't let that happen. So he came down from London, prepared one last dose of the tonic with an even higher concentration of digitalis, and ensured his aunt took it. The room fell into stunned silence. Even Colonel Melchett, accustomed to dealing with crime, looked shaken by the calculated nature of the suspected murder. "Can you prove any of this?" he asked finally. "The sample I took is with a toxicologist in London. I should have the analysis back by Monday. It will prove the tonic contained dangerous levels of digitalis. As for the rest..." Dr. Haydock shrugged helplessly. Philip Ashworth disposed of the bottle and any remaining evidence. Without exhumation and a proper post-mortem examination, I don't know what more can be proven. Colonel Melchett stood, his decision made. "Then we'll have an exhumation. I'll arrange for the necessary warrants and contact Scotland Yard. If there's evidence of murder, by God, we'll find it." Miss Marple rose as well, gathering her handbag. "Colonel, before you take official action, might I suggest one small experiment? Something that might provide the proof you need without the trauma and expense of exhumation." Chapter 7. Miss Marple's Gambit. Colonel Melchett regarded Miss Marple with the mixture of skepticism and reluctant respect he had developed over their years of acquaintance. "An experiment, Miss Marple? What sort of experiment?" "A simple one, really, though it will require your cooperation, Doctor, and perhaps a small deception on the Colonel's part." Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her fingers absently smoothing her gloves. "You see, I've been thinking about human nature, specifically about the nature of someone who would commit such a calculated crime. This wasn't a crime of passion, Colonel. It was methodical, planned over months. Such a person would be confident in their cleverness, secure in the belief that they've left no evidence behind." "Go on," Colonel Melchett said, leaning against his desk. "Well, in my experience, such confidence can be, shall we say, destabilized. I once knew a young woman in the village who had stolen from her employer over several months. She was quite certain she'd covered her tracks perfectly. But when the employer casually mentioned having the accounts audited, the young woman's composure cracked entirely. She confessed within hours, unable to bear the suspense of waiting for discovery." Dr. Haydock's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "You want to make Philip Ashworth believe we're closing in on him? Make him think we have evidence we don't actually possess?" "Not quite, Doctor. I want to make him believe that his aunt left behind something incriminating, something he doesn't know about and cannot destroy, because he doesn't know where it is." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp as a hawk's. "In my experience, guilty parties often reveal themselves when they believe they're about to be exposed." "What sort of evidence are you suggesting?" Colonel Melchett asked. "A diary, perhaps? Or a letter Mrs. Ashworth wrote but didn't send? Something that explicitly details her suspicions about the tonic and her nephew's behavior?" Miss Marple paused delicately. "Of course, no such document actually exists as far as we know, but Mr. Ashworth doesn't know that." Mrs. Meeker, who had been listening with rapt attention, suddenly straightened. "But Miss Marple, Mrs. Ashworth did keep a diary, a small leather-bound book she wrote in most evenings. I'd see it on her bedside table when I was cleaning upstairs." The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Colonel Melchett and Dr. Haydock exchanged glances. "Do you know what became of this diary?" the Colonel asked urgently. "I haven't seen it since before she died, but it wouldn't have been in the drawing room where she collapsed. She always kept it upstairs in her bedroom. Mrs. Meeker's face grew animated. Mr. Philip wouldn't necessarily know about it. Mrs. Ashworth was private about her writing. She once told me it was just her way of sorting out her thoughts before sleep. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Then the diary may still exist, hidden somewhere in the cottage. Or Mr. Ashworth may have found and destroyed it. But either way, Colonel, I believe we can use its existence, or the possibility of its existence, to our advantage. You want me to tell Ashworth we've found a diary implicating him? Colonel Melchett said flatly. Not exactly. I want you to let it be known, through appropriately discreet channels, that Mrs. Ashworth's former solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, has mentioned the existence of a diary, and that the police are interested in examining it. You needn't claim to have it in your possession. Simply the suggestion that it exists and contains relevant information should be sufficient. Dr. Haydock rubbed his chin thoughtfully. It might work. If Ashworth believes his aunt documented his actions, he'll be desperate to find the diary before we do. And in that desperation, he might reveal something incriminating. Or, Colonel Melchett said heavily, he might simply claim that if such a diary exists, it will only confirm his devoted care for his aunt. After all, we still have no concrete proof of his intentions. Ah, but that's where the second part of my suggestion comes in, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Meeker, you still have a key to Meadowbrook Cottage, I presume? You would need to collect your cleaning supplies and any personal items you may have left there. I do, yes. Mr. Philip told me I needn't come back to work, but he said I could retrieve my things whenever I liked. Excellent. Then I propose that you and I pay a visit to the cottage tomorrow morning. Quite openly, nothing clandestine. We'll collect your belongings and, while we're there, we might naturally look around for anything Mrs. Ashworth might have wanted you to have. A small keepsake, perhaps. It would be quite normal for a former employer to leave some token for a faithful servant in her diary or a letter. Colonel Melchett caught on immediately. And if Ashworth is there, or learns of your visit, he'll assume you're searching for the diary. Precisely. And his reaction, whether he attempts to prevent our search, or tries to locate the diary himself, or simply the expression on his face when the subject is mentioned, will tell us a great deal about his guilt or innocence. Dr. Haydock frowned. It's risky, Miss Marple. If Ashworth is indeed a murderer, having you and Mrs. Meeker poking about his house could be dangerous. I appreciate your concern, Doctor, but I'm hardly a threat to a young man in his prime. Just a harmless old lady helping to collect a cleaning woman's possessions. What could be more innocent? Miss Marple's smile was serene, but there was steel beneath the gentle exterior. Besides, I have every confidence that Colonel Melchett will ensure we're properly watched over. Damned right I will, the Colonel muttered. I'll have Constable Polk stationed nearby, in plain clothes. At the first sign of trouble, there won't be trouble, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Mr. Ashworth is far too clever for overt violence. His method has been subtle, patient, designed to appear natural. He won't deviate from that pattern unless absolutely forced to. No, what we're looking for is something more revealing than violence. We're looking for fear, for the mask of the devoted nephew to slip and reveal what lies beneath. Mrs. Meeker looked uncertain. I'm not sure I'm brave enough for this, Miss Marple. My dear Mrs. Meeker, you've already shown tremendous courage by coming forward with your concerns. All you need do tomorrow is accompany me to the cottage, collect your belongings, and observe. I'll do any necessary talking. Miss Marple patted the woman's hand reassuringly. "And remember, we'll be perfectly safe. The Colonel will see to that." Colonel Melchett began making notes on a pad. "Very well. I'll spread word through Pemberton this evening about the supposed diary. News travels fast in St. Mary Mead. By morning, half the village will know, including Ashworth. I'll also contact my counterpart in London, see what we can learn about Philip Ashworth's financial situation. If he was desperate enough to murder for an inheritance, there's usually a reason." "An excellent suggestion," Miss Marple approved. "In my experience, murder for money is rarely about simple greed. It's usually about desperation, debts that must be paid, losses that must be covered, a lifestyle that cannot be maintained. The question is, what was Philip Ashworth so desperate to obtain that he was willing to kill his own aunt for it?" Dr. Haydock stood, his expression grim but determined. "I'll have the toxicology report rushed through. If we're going to confront Ashworth, we'll need every piece of evidence we can gather." As the meeting concluded and arrangements were finalized, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had set in motion a dangerous game, one that would force a potential murderer into revealing himself. It was not without risk, but then again, justice rarely was. That evening, as twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the lights come on in Meadowbrook Cottage. Philip Ashworth's silhouette passed before the windows, pacing back and forth with what seemed like agitation. "Tomorrow," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "Tomorrow we shall see what sort of man you truly are, Mr. Ashworth. Tomorrow the mask will slip, and the truth will finally reveal itself." Across the lane, the pacing figure paused at the window, staring out into the darkness as if sensing the net closing around him. Chapter 8. The Search. Sunday morning dawned with unseasonable warmth, the kind of bright, clear day that seemed to mock the dark business at hand. Miss Marple dressed with particular care, choosing a dove-grey dress and her second-best hat, the one that made her look especially harmless and elderly. She collected Mrs. Meeker from her cottage at precisely 10 o'clock, noting the woman's pallor and trembling hands. "Courage, my dear," Miss Marple said softly as they walked toward Meadowbrook Cottage. "Remember, we're simply collecting your belongings. Nothing more complicated than that." "But what if he's there? What if he knows what we're really looking for?" "If he's there, we shall be perfectly polite and perfectly innocent. And if he knows what we're looking for, well, that in itself will tell us something important, won't it?" They had reached the gate when Philip Ashworth's motor car pulled into the drive with rather more speed than was strictly necessary. He emerged looking haggard, his usually immaculate appearance slightly dishevelled, his eyes red-rimmed from what might have been lack of sleep or perhaps something more emotional. "Mrs. Meeker," he said, his voice carefully controlled but with an underlying tension. "I wasn't expecting you this morning." "I'm sorry to intrude, Mr. Ashworth. I've come to collect my cleaning supplies and a few personal items I left in the scullery. Miss Marple was kind enough to accompany me." Mrs. Meeker's voice wavered only slightly. Philip's gaze shifted to Miss Marple, and for just a moment, something cold and calculating flickered in his eyes before the mask of polite grief slid back into place. "Miss Marple, how neighbourly of you." He unlocked the front door with hands that were not quite steady. "Please, come in. Though I must warn you, the house is in some disarray. I've been going through my aunt's papers and possessions, So many memories to sort through. The interior of Meadowbrook Cottage looked as though a violent wind had torn through it. Drawers stood open, their contents spilled across surfaces. Books had been pulled from shelves. Even the cushions on the sofa had been displaced, as though someone had been searching beneath them. "Good heavens," Miss Marple said mildly. "What a task you've undertaken. It must be quite overwhelming. Yes, well, estate matters are complicated." Philip's laugh was forced. "I've been looking for various documents, insurance policies, bank statements, that sort of thing. My aunt wasn't always terribly organized about record-keeping." "Strange," Miss Marple observed, her tone conversational. "I always found Mrs. Ashworth to be most meticulous. She kept detailed household accounts, I know. And didn't she maintain a personal diary? I seem to recall her mentioning it at the church garden party last year." The effect of these words was electric. Philip's face went rigid, and the muscle at his jaw jumped visibly. "A diary? I don't know anything about a diary." "Oh, perhaps I'm mistaken. One's memory at my age." Miss Marple trailed off vaguely, moving further into the drawing room. "Mrs. Meeker, didn't you mention that Mrs. Ashworth kept a small leather-bound book by her bedside?" Mrs. Meeker, following Miss Marple's lead admirably, nodded. "That's right, Miss Marple. A brown leather diary with gold edges to the pages. She wrote in it most evenings before sleep. Said it helped her organize her thoughts." "I haven't seen any diary," Philip said, his voice too sharp, too quick. "If it existed, it's probably just mundane household notes. What she had for dinner, the weather, that sort of trivia." "Quite possibly," Miss Marple agreed, "though sometimes people do record more significant matters in their private journals. Worries, concerns, observations about those around them." She paused by the mantelpiece, examining the photographs there. It would be natural for Mrs. Ashworth to document her thoughts, especially if she was feeling troubled about anything. Troubled? My aunt wasn't troubled. She was perfectly content. But Philip's hands were clenching and unclenching at his sides, and his eyes kept darting toward the staircase that led to the bedrooms above. At that moment, Veronica Ashworth emerged from the study, her own appearance dishevelled, a smudge of dust across one cheek. She stopped short when she saw the visitors, her expression transforming from surprise to something approaching hostility. "What are they doing here?" she demanded of her husband. "Mrs. Meeker is collecting her belongings," Philip said tightly, "and Miss Marple is helping." Veronica's laugh was bitter. "Helping? How kind!" She turned to Miss Marple, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I suppose you've come to poke your nose into our affairs, like everyone else in this wretched village. Don't think we haven't heard the whispers, the speculation. It's disgusting." "I can understand your distress," Miss Marple said calmly. "Grief makes us all sensitive to perceived slights. But I assure you, Mrs. Ashworth, I'm merely accompanying Mrs. Meeker. Nothing more sinister than that." "Then why are you asking about a diary?" Veronica snapped. "Yes, I heard you. And I'll tell you what I told that solicitor Pemberton when he came sniffing around yesterday. If there's a diary, it's private property. It belongs to Philip now, just like everything else in this house." "Actually," came a new voice from the doorway, "that's not entirely accurate." They all turned to find Mr. Pemberton standing at the threshold, his expression stern and his presence radiating legal authority. Behind him, to Miss Marple's satisfaction, stood Colonel Melchett and Constable Polk. "Mr. Pemberton," Philip said, his voice strangled. "Colonel, what is the meaning of this intrusion?" "No intrusion, Mr. Ashworth. Merely a few questions that require answers." Colonel Melchett stepped into the room, his bulk seeming to fill the space. "Questions about your aunt's death, the circumstances leading up to it, and certain medications she was taking at your recommendation." The colour drained from Philip's face. Veronica moved instinctively to his side, gripping his arm. "You can't just barge in here making accusations. We know our rights." "Indeed you do," Pemberton said smoothly, "which is why I've taken the liberty of obtaining a court order." He produced a document from his briefcase. "This grants the police access to Mrs. Ashworth's personal effects, including any diaries, letters or documents that might shed light on her state of mind and her health in the weeks before her death." "This is absurd," Philip said, but his voice lacked conviction. "My aunt died of heart failure. The doctor signed the death certificate. There's nothing suspicious about it." "Then you'll have no objection to us conducting a thorough search," Colonel Melchett said. "Polk, start upstairs. Miss Marple, perhaps you and Mrs. Meeker could assist. You're both familiar with the household and might recognize items of significance." Philip looked as though he might protest, but Veronica's grip on his arm tightened. "Let them search," she said through gritted teeth. "They'll find nothing because there's nothing to find." But as Miss Marple climbed the stairs behind Constable Polk, she noted the way Philip's eyes followed them. The desperation barely concealed behind his facade of indignation. He was afraid, not of what they might find, but of what had already been found. Mrs. Ashworth's bedroom was in marginally better condition than the rooms below, though here too there were signs of hasty searching. The bedside table drawer hung open, its contents scattered. The wardrobe doors stood ajar. "He's already looked here," Mrs. Meeker whispered. "He's been searching for the diary." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "which means either he found it and has already destroyed it, or—" She moved to the bed, running her hand thoughtfully along the mattress edge. "Mrs. Meeker, you said Mrs. Ashworth was a private person about her diary. If she feared someone might try to read it, where would she hide it?" The cleaning woman thought for a moment. Then her eyes widened. "The linen cupboard. There's a loose board at the back. Mrs. Ashworth showed me once when I was putting away sheets. She said it had been there since the house was built. A perfect little hiding place. She kept some old love letters from her late husband there, said they were too precious to leave where anyone might accidentally see them." They moved quickly to the hallway linen cupboard. Miss Marple's fingers, surprisingly nimble for her age, found the loose board immediately. Behind it was a small cavity, and within that cavity lay a brown leather diary with gold-edged pages. "Constable Polk," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe you should see this." Chapter 9. Words from Beyond the Grave. The diary lay open on Colonel Melchett's desk at Gossington Hall, its pages filled with Mrs. Ashworth's careful, elegant handwriting. Miss Marple sat to one side, her knitting abandoned in her lap as she watched the Colonel read, his expression growing progressively darker with each turned page. Dr. Haydock stood by the window, his medical bag at his feet, while Mr. Pemberton occupied the chair beside Miss Marple, his solicitor's mind already cataloguing the legal implications of what they were discovering. "Good God," Colonel Melchett muttered, his finger tracing a particularly damning passage. "She documented everything, every conversation, every suspicion, every dose of that damned tonic." "May I?" Miss Marple asked gently. The Colonel passed her the diary, opened to an entry dated 3 weeks before Mrs. Ashworth's death. Miss Marple read aloud, her quiet voice lending additional weight to the dead woman's words. "Philip came again today, unannounced as usual. He brought another bottle of the tonic, insisting I must continue the treatment despite my protests that it makes me feel worse, not better. When I suggested seeing Dr. Haydock about it, Philip became quite agitated. He said London specialists know far more than country doctors, that I must trust him. But there was something in his eyes, something cold and calculating that frightened me. I think of the property transfer he convinced me to sign, the new will, and I wonder if I've been an old fool. She turned to another entry. This one dated just 5 days before the death. I went to see Gerald Pemberton today. I didn't tell Philip. He would only try to talk me out of it again. Gerald was shocked when I explained how Philip had pressured me into changing solicitors, into transferring the property. He said the timing was highly irregular, that I should never have been rushed into such decisions. He's going to look into reversing everything, but he warned me it will take time. I'm frightened now. Philip telephoned 3 times today, asking peculiar questions about my health, about whether I'm still taking the tonic regularly. There's something wrong. I feel it in my bones. Dr. Haydock's voice was hoarse when he spoke. The final entry! Read the final entry! Miss Marple found the last page with writing. It was dated the day before Mrs. Ashworth's death, the handwriting shakier than in previous entries, as though written by a trembling hand. I confronted Philip about the tonic today. I told him Dr. Haydock examined it and found dangerous levels of digitalis. Philip's face. I've never seen such rage. He said I was an ungrateful old woman, that after all he'd done for me, I repaid him with suspicion and accusations. He stormed out, but not before saying something chilling. You've already signed everything over, Aunt Lydia. It's too late for second thoughts now. I'm genuinely afraid. I've written to Gerald asking him to come urgently. I've also told Dr. Haydock everything. If anything happens to me, let this diary stand as testimony that I did not trust my nephew, that I believed he was trying to harm me. God forgive me if I'm wrong, but God help me if I'm right. The silence that followed was profound. Even Colonel Melchett, accustomed to dealing with criminal matters, seemed shaken by the stark fear evident in those final words. She knew, Mrs. Meeker whispered from her position near the door. She knew, and she was frightened, and no one protected her. She tried to protect herself, Mr. Pemberton said, his voice heavy with guilt. She reached out to me, but I was in London on business. I didn't receive her letter until it was too late. If I had only been available when she called, you cannot blame yourself, Miss Marple interrupted firmly. The blame lies with one person only, the person who administered that final, fatal dose. She looked at Colonel Melchett. This diary provides clear evidence of Philip Ashworth's motive and his aunt's suspicions, but it still doesn't prove he actually murdered her. No, but combined with the toxicology report that arrived this morning, it's damning. Dr. Haydock pulled a document from his bag. The sample I took from the tonic bottle showed digitalis concentration at nearly 3 times the safe therapeutic level. For someone already taking heart medication, it was a slow poison. Each dose weakened her further, made her more vulnerable to cardiac arrest. But Philip disposed of the bottle, Colonel Melchett said. Without it, can we prove he prepared that final dose? Actually, Mr. Pemberton interjected, we may have more evidence than you realize. I took the liberty of contacting the Harley Street practice, whose name appeared on the tonic label, the one Philip claimed had prescribed it. They have no record of Mrs. Ashworth as a patient, nor do they prepare any tonic matching that description. The label was fraudulent. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So Philip obtained digitalis, easily enough done if one knows where to look, prepared it himself to appear as a legitimate medication, and convinced his aunt to take it regularly. The gradual weakening would have appeared as natural deterioration of her heart condition. And when she discovered the deception and tried to reverse the property transfer, Dr. Haydock added, his voice grim, he realized he had to act quickly. One final, massive dose to trigger complete heart failure before she could undo his arrangements. Premeditated murder, Colonel Melchett said flatly. Calculated over months. Good God, to kill one's own aunt for money. Not just money, Miss Marple observed quietly. I suspect if you investigate Mr. Ashworth's financial situation, Colonel, you'll find he was desperate. Men don't commit such calculated crimes simply from greed. They do so from necessity. From debts they cannot pay. From a lifestyle they cannot maintain without funds they don't possess. I'll telegraph Scotland Yard immediately. They can investigate his affairs in London. Colonel Melchett stood, his decision made. In the meantime, I'm having Philip Ashworth brought in for questioning. Between this diary, the toxicology report, and the fraudulent medication label, we have sufficient cause to charge him. What about his wife? Mrs. Meeker asked. Mrs. Veronica. Was she part of it? Miss Marple considered this carefully. That remains to be seen. She certainly knew something was wrong. Her behavior suggested as much. Whether she actively participated in the murder or simply chose to ignore her suspicions to protect her financial interests, I cannot say. Though I suspect the truth lies somewhere between complicity and willful blindness. We'll question her as well, the Colonel assured them. If she had knowledge of the crime and failed to report it, she's an accessory after the fact at minimum. As Colonel Melchett began making arrangements for the arrests, Miss Marple picked up the diary again, turning to a passage from several months earlier, when Mrs. Ashworth's suspicions had first begun to form. I taught Philip to be ambitious, to want more from life than mere contentment. But I fear I taught him too well. There's something missing in him, some quality of conscience that should prevent a man from valuing money over human life, over family bonds, over simple decency. I pray I'm wrong about him. I pray these are the paranoid thoughts of a lonely old woman. But I don't think I am. She knew his character, Miss Marple said softly. She understood what he was capable of, even as she hoped she was mistaken. How terrible to die, knowing that your own family values your property more than your life. Dr. Haydock placed a hand on her shoulder. Thanks to you, Miss Marple, her death won't go unpunished. Justice will be served. Justice, yes, Miss Marple agreed, though it won't bring her back, will it? It won't undo the fear she felt in those final weeks. The betrayal of knowing her own nephew wished her dead. She carefully closed the diary, her fingers gentle on its worn leather cover. But perhaps it will prevent others from suffering the same fate. Perhaps that's the best we can hope for. Through the window, they could see Constable Polk approaching with 2 uniformed officers from Much Benham. The time had come to confront Philip Ashworth with the evidence of his crime, to strip away the mask of the devoted nephew and reveal the calculating murderer beneath. Chapter 10. The confrontation. The arrest took place at Meadowbrook Cottage just as the church bells were striking noon. Miss Marple, having insisted on accompanying Colonel Melchett despite his protests about propriety and safety, watched from the motor car as the officers approached the front door. She had her reasons for being present, reasons that had less to do with mere curiosity, and more to do with observing how a cornered murderer would react when finally exposed. Philip Ashworth answered the door himself, still dressed in the same clothes from that morning, his hair dishevelled and his eyes wild. The facade of the grieving nephew had crumbled entirely, replaced by something raw and desperate. Mr. Ashworth, Colonel Melchett said with formal gravity, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Lydia Ashworth. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence against you." For a moment, Philip simply stared, his mouth working soundlessly. Then, to everyone's surprise, he laughed, a harsh, brittle sound devoid of humor. "Murder? You're arresting me for murder? She was 73 years old with a failing heart. She died of natural causes." "She died of digitalis poisoning, administered deliberately over several months, through a fraudulent tonic that you prepared and convinced her to take," Colonel Melchett replied steadily. "We have her diary, Mr. Ashworth. We have the toxicology reports. We have testimony from multiple witnesses about your suspicious behavior. And we have proof that the Harley Street practice you claimed prescribed the tonic has no record of your aunt as a patient." The color drained from Philip's face. "The diary," he whispered. "You found the damned diary." His eyes, wild and unfocused, suddenly fixed on Miss Marple sitting in the motor car. You interfering old woman, this is your doing." "I merely helped search for the truth," Miss Marple said calmly through the open window. "The doing, Mr. Ashworth, was entirely your own. I needed that money." Philip's voice rose to a shout, all pretense of innocence abandoned. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be drowning in debt? To have everything, reputation, career, marriage, hanging by a thread because you made a few bad investments? She had more money than she could ever spend, sitting in that house, hoarding it like some miserly dragon." "So you decided to hasten your inheritance," Colonel Melchett said coldly, "by murdering a woman who had taken you in after your parents died, who had supported you, who trusted you. She was going to reverse everything." Philip's composure had shattered completely now, his voice cracking with rage and self-pity. "I finally convinced her to transfer the property, to make a sensible will, and then that meddling fool Pemberton poisoned her mind against me. She was going to take it all back, leave me with nothing after everything I'd done for her." "Everything you'd done?" Mrs. Meeker's voice rang out from behind the officers, trembling with fury. "You poisoned her, you made her sick and weak and frightened, and you call that doing something for her?" Philip's wild gaze swung to the cleaning woman. "You don't understand, none of you understand. I didn't want to hurt her. I just needed her gone. I needed the money before my creditors destroyed me, before Veronica left me, before everything I'd built collapsed." His voice dropped to something almost pleading. "It would have been quick. One final dose while she slept, and it would have looked like her heart simply gave out in the night. Peaceful, dignified. But she woke up. She saw me standing there with the glass, and she knew, God, the look in her eyes when she realized what I was about to do." The admission hung in the air like a death knell. Even the hardened police officers looked shaken by the casual way Philip had described his planned murder. "So she didn't drink it willingly," Dr. Haydock said, emerging from the cottage with Veronica Ashworth, who looked pale and shocked. "You forced her. I didn't force anything." Philip's voice rose again, defensive and desperate. I explained that she'd already signed everything over, that there was no point in fighting it. I told her the tonic would help her sleep, that she'd feel better in the morning. She was confused, disoriented from the medication. She drank it because she always did what I suggested. She trusted me, right to the very end. "You monster," Veronica whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I knew something was wrong. I knew, but I told myself I was imagining things. I wanted to believe you were just helping her, managing her affairs. I didn't want to see the truth." Philip turned to his wife with something like contempt. "Don't pretend you're innocent, Veronica. You knew exactly what that tonic was doing to her. You saw her getting weaker, saw me bringing those bottles from London. You asked me once if I was sure it was safe, and when I said it was necessary, you never asked again. You didn't want to know because you liked the idea of this house, of the money, of the life we could have once she was gone. That's not true. Veronica's voice broke. I never wanted her dead. I never agreed to murder. But you never stopped me either, did you? You simply looked the other way and counted the inheritance in your head. Philip's laugh was bitter. We're both guilty, darling. The only difference is that I had the courage to act. Colonel Melchett nodded to his officers. Take him, and Mrs. Ashworth as well. We'll sort out the extent of her involvement at the station. As the constables moved forward with handcuffs, Philip's eyes swept across the assembled faces. The police, the cleaning woman, the doctor, and finally Miss Marple, still seated calmly in the motor car, her expression one of quiet sorrow rather than triumph. You think you've won, he said to her, his voice cold. You think justice has been served, but all you've done is destroy what was left of a desperate man trying to survive. My aunt was going to die anyway. Her heart was failing. I simply moved the timeline forward by a few months, maybe a year at most. Is that really murder? Or is it just pragmatism? Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. You took a human life, Mr. Ashworth. You betrayed the trust of someone who loved you. You caused fear and suffering to a vulnerable woman in the final weeks of her life. Whether she had months or years remaining is immaterial. You had no right to make that decision. You had no right to play God. God? Philip laughed again, a sound edged with hysteria, as the officers grasped his arms. There is no God. There's only survival, only what we can take before someone else takes it from us. My aunt understood that once. She built her fortune by being ruthless in business. I simply learned from her example. No, Dr. Haydock said quietly. Mrs. Ashworth built her fortune through hard work and intelligence, but she never forgot her humanity. She was generous to those who served her, kind to those in need. The lesson you learned, Mr. Ashworth, was not one she ever intended to teach. As Philip was led away, still protesting, still justifying, Veronica collapsed against the doorframe, her sobs echoing across the quiet lane. Mr. Pemberton approached her with professional sympathy, explaining that she would need legal representation, that her cooperation with the investigation would be taken into consideration. Miss Marple remained in the motor car, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful. Colonel Melchett joined her, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. Nasty business, he said heavily. Nastier still that he shows no real remorse. Even now, he's justifying it as necessity. That is often the way with such people, Miss Marple observed. They convince themselves that their circumstances justify their actions, that they are victims rather than perpetrators. It allows them to commit terrible crimes without facing the truth about themselves. Well, he'll face the truth now. The evidence is overwhelming. The diary, his own confession, the toxicology reports. He'll hang for this, no question. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes distant. Justice will be served. Though I confess, Colonel, I find no satisfaction in it. Only a deep sadness that human nature can be so twisted, that the love of money can corrupt so completely. Chapter 11. Unraveling the Web. The following days saw St. Mary Mead consumed with talk of nothing but the Ashworth murder. Miss Marple found herself the reluctant centre of attention, with villagers stopping her on every corner to express their shock, their fascination, their morbid curiosity about the details. She deflected most inquiries with her characteristic gentle vagueness, but there remained loose threads that required her attention before the matter could be truly considered resolved. It was Thursday afternoon when she received an unexpected visitor. Veronica Ashworth stood at her door, no longer the polished London wife, but a haggard woman aged by grief and guilt, her black dress hanging loosely on a frame that had lost weight in just days. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice hoarse, "may I speak with you? I know I have no right to ask, but I need someone to understand." Miss Marple stepped aside, gesturing her into the sitting room. She prepared tea in silence, giving the younger woman time to compose herself. When they were finally seated, Veronica's hands trembled so badly she could barely hold her cup. "They're not charging me," she said abruptly. "Colonel Melchett said there's insufficient evidence that I knowingly participated in the murder, but I did know, Miss Marple. Not consciously, perhaps, but in my heart I knew something terrible was happening, and I chose not to see it." "Why have you come to tell me this?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Because everyone else either condemns me or absolves me, and neither is the truth." Veronica set down her cup, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with desperate honesty. "I need to tell someone what really happened. I need to speak it aloud, even if it damns me." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles beginning their steady rhythm. "Then speak, my dear. I'm listening." Veronica took a shuddering breath. "Philip and I married 5 years ago. I thought I loved him. He was charming, ambitious, everything my parents hoped I would find. But after the wedding, I began to see another side. The extravagant spending, the risky investments, the lies about where money was going. Within 2 years, we were deeply in debt. Philip's salary couldn't cover even a fraction of what he'd borrowed." She paused, staring at her hands. When his parents died and left him nothing, they'd spent everything on medical bills. He became obsessed with his Aunt Lydia. She was his only remaining relative with any means. He visited her constantly, and at first I thought it was genuine affection. But then I heard him on the telephone with creditors, promising them he'd have money soon, that his aunt was elderly and unwell. The implication was clear. "You suspected he was waiting for her death," Miss Marple said quietly. "More than waiting, counting on it, planning for it." Veronica's voice dropped to a whisper. "Last autumn, he came home with bottles of medicine. He said they were special tonics for his aunt's heart, prescribed by an expensive London specialist. He seemed excited, almost gleeful. I asked if they were safe, and he laughed and said, 'Safe enough. They'll do exactly what they're meant to do.'" Miss Marple's needles paused. "And you didn't question what he meant?" "I told myself he meant they would help her. I forced myself to believe it, because the alternative was unbearable." Tears began sliding down Veronica's cheeks, but as the months passed, Philip would come back from his visits, talking about how much weaker she was getting, how the end was near. He wasn't sad, Miss Marple. He was impatient, eager. And I knew then, in my heart, what he was doing. But I said nothing because I was terrified of losing everything. The house we'd mortgaged, the lifestyle I'd grown accustomed to, even Philip himself. When did you realize the full extent of his plan? The week before Mrs. Ashworth died. Philip came home triumphant, saying he'd convinced her to transfer the property and change her will. He said it was done, that we were saved. But then he received a telephone call. I only heard his side of the conversation, but he was furious. He kept saying, "She can't do this. She can't reverse it now." When he hung up, his hands were shaking. Veronica looked up, her eyes haunted. I asked what was wrong, and he said his aunt was being difficult, that she'd been talking to her old solicitor about undoing the arrangements. He said he couldn't let that happen, that too much depended on it. I asked what he meant, and he looked at me with such cold calculation and said, "Sometimes you have to take decisive action before opportunities slip away." "And still you said nothing," Miss Marple observed, without judgment in her tone. "I was a coward. I told myself I was misunderstanding, that he couldn't possibly mean what I thought he meant." The next day, he left for St. Mary Mead unexpectedly, said he needed to check on his aunt. He came back late that night, and I'd never seen him so agitated. He wouldn't speak to me, just paced the flat drinking whiskey until dawn. The following evening, he received the telegram about her death. He read it, and for just a moment, I saw something in his face. Relief mixed with terror. That's when I knew with absolute certainty what he had done. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her expression grave, but not unkind. "Why are you telling me this now, Mrs. Ashworth? The investigation is concluded. Your husband has confessed. You could simply walk away, rebuild your life, because I can't walk away from my conscience," Veronica said, her voice breaking. "I enabled his crime through my silence. Mrs. Ashworth died frightened and alone because I was too selfish to speak up, to warn her, to stop Philip before it was too late. I'm not legally guilty, but morally, I'm as culpable as he is." Miss Marple studied the younger woman with eyes that had witnessed countless variations of human weakness and strength. "What will you do now?" "I've spoken with Mr. Pemberton. Mrs. Ashworth's will, the one Philip forced her to sign, is being contested. Once the legal matters are settled, I intend to ensure that her true wishes are honoured. The charities she supported, the people she cared about, they should benefit from her estate, not me. It won't bring her back, but it's the only restitution I can offer." "That is a good start," Miss Marple said gently, "though the hardest part will be learning to live with what you know about yourself, about what you are willing to ignore for the sake of comfort and security." Veronica nodded, wiping her eyes. "I've left Philip. I've given my statement to the police, and I've written a letter to Mrs. Ashworth. I know she can't read it, but I needed to apologize, to acknowledge my failure." She stood, her bearing somehow straighter despite her distress. "Thank you for listening, Miss Marple. And thank you for having the courage I lacked. You saved others from suffering the same fate at Philip's hands." After Veronica had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while in her chair, her knitting forgotten. She thought of Lydia Ashworth, dying in fear and betrayal. She thought of Philip Ashworth, awaiting trial and almost certainly execution. And she thought of Veronica, condemned to live with the knowledge of her moral cowardice. "Human nature," she murmured to the empty room, "always so complex, so capable of both terrible weakness and surprising strength." Chapter 12. Reflections and Justice. 3 months had passed since the arrest of Philip Ashworth, and autumn had settled over St. Mary Mead with its particular melancholy beauty. The leaves on the old oak trees turned copper and gold, drifting down to carpet the churchyard where Lydia Ashworth rested beneath a simple granite headstone. The scandal had gradually faded from daily conversation, replaced by newer gossip and fresher concerns, as was the way of village life. Miss Marple sat in her customary chair by the window, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm as she worked on a soft blue cardigan. Across the lane, Meadowbrook Cottage stood empty, its windows dark and its garden beginning to show signs of neglect. The property was in legal limbo, while the courts sorted through the tangled mess of wills, transfers and criminal proceedings. A knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. She set aside her work and opened it to find Dr. Haydock, his medical bag in hand, his expression weary, but somehow lighter than it had been in recent months. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, "I hope I'm not intruding. I've just come from the vicarage and thought I might stop by with some news." "Please, come in, Doctor. I've just put the kettle on." She led him to the sitting room, noting the lines of strain that had eased somewhat from his face. "You look as though you've shed a burden." "Perhaps I have." He settled into the chair she offered. "The trial concluded yesterday in London. Philip Ashworth was found guilty of murder. The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out at Wandsworth Prison in 6 weeks' time." Miss Marple absorbed this information with quiet solemnity. "And how do you feel about that outcome, Doctor?" Haydock was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I feel that justice has been served, though it brings me no joy. I've been a doctor for 30 years, Miss Marple. My purpose is to preserve life, not to see it ended, even when that life belongs to a murderer. But I also think of Lydia Ashworth, of how she trusted me to protect her, and how I failed to act quickly enough. Perhaps this verdict provides some measure of closure for that failure." "You did everything within your power," Miss Marple said gently, pouring tea. "You identified the poison. You warned Mrs. Ashworth. You took a sample for analysis. The fault lies entirely with Philip Ashworth, who acted with calculated malice despite every opportunity to choose differently." "I know that intellectually, but emotionally?" He shook his head. "I keep thinking about that Monday evening when I visited her. If I had stayed longer, if I had confiscated all her medications rather than just taking a sample, if I had insisted she come to stay at my surgery until the matter was resolved, if, Miss Marple interrupted softly. "We could spend our lives dwelling on what might have been. But the reality is that Mrs. Ashworth was a competent adult who made her own choices. She chose to confront her nephew. She chose to write that letter to Mr. Pemberton. And tragically, she chose to open her door to Philip when he arrived that final evening, despite her fears. We cannot protect people from the consequences of their trust, Doctor, no matter how misplaced that trust may be." Haydock sipped his tea, his expression thoughtful. The toxicology evidence was damning. The concentration of digitalis in her system was nearly 4 times the therapeutic level. The prosecution's expert witness testified that the final dose alone would have been sufficient to kill her, even without the months of accumulated poisoning. Philip showed no remorse throughout the trial. He maintained that he'd simply been helping his aunt manage her medications, that any harm was accidental. Did anyone believe him? Not for a moment, particularly not after the prosecution presented evidence of his debts. He owed nearly £15,000 to various creditors, Miss Marple. His investments had failed spectacularly, and he was weeks away from bankruptcy. The motive was painfully clear. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a quiet clink. And what of Mrs. Veronica Ashworth? Was she called to testify? She was, and to her credit, she told the truth about her suspicions, about Philip's behavior, about her own moral cowardice in failing to act on what she knew in her heart. The judge was harsh with her, said she'd failed in her duty as a human being, if not as a legal matter. But there was insufficient evidence to charge her with any crime. She's left London, I understand, gone to live with family in Scotland, trying to rebuild her life away from the scandal. A kind of exile, Miss Marple observed, perhaps appropriate, given the circumstances. She must live with the knowledge of what her silence cost. That may be punishment enough. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the afternoon sun slanting through the lace curtains and casting delicate patterns on the worn carpet. From outside came the distant sound of children playing, the normalcy of village life continuing despite the darkness that had briefly touched it. "There's one more piece of news," Dr. Haydock said. "The courts have ruled that Philip Ashworth's inheritance is forfeit under the Forfeiture Act. A murderer cannot profit from his crime. Mrs. Ashworth's estate will be distributed according to her original will, the one she made 20 years ago with Gerald Pemberton. The bulk goes to various charities, with generous bequests to Mrs. Meeker and several other long-time employees and friends." "That would have pleased her," Miss Marple said with satisfaction. "Mrs. Ashworth was always generous to those who served her faithfully. It's fitting that her true wishes should ultimately prevail. Pemberton is also arranging for Meadowbrook Cottage to be sold, with the proceeds going to a fund for elderly persons without family support. He said Mrs. Ashworth had mentioned such a charity in conversations with him over the years, that she'd experienced loneliness herself and wished to help others in similar circumstances." Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady clicking. A legacy of kindness to counter the legacy of greed and betrayal. Yes, I think Mrs. Ashworth would approve of that very much indeed. Dr. Haydock finished his tea and stood to leave. "You know, Miss Marple, when this all began, I was skeptical of your suspicions. I thought you were seeing shadows where none existed, imagining crimes out of unfortunate coincidences. I was wrong to doubt you." "You weren't wrong to be skeptical, Doctor. Skepticism is healthy. It prevents us from making accusations without evidence. But skepticism must be balanced with observation, with attention to patterns of behavior that don't quite fit the innocent explanation." She walked him to the door. "In my experience, when something seems wrong, when too many coincidences align too conveniently, it's worth investigating further. Human nature follows predictable patterns, and those patterns reveal truth if we're patient enough to observe them. Well, your patience and observation brought a murderer to justice. The village owes you a debt of gratitude." Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. "The village owes me nothing. I simply did what any concerned neighbor would do. I paid attention, I asked questions, and I refused to accept easy answers when deeper truth was waiting to be discovered. That's not heroism, Doctor. It's merely responsibility." After he'd gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. The afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening across the lane as the sun dipped toward the horizon. She thought of Lydia Ashworth, of the fear she must have felt in those final moments, when she realized her own nephew intended her death. She thought of Philip Ashworth, awaiting execution, still apparently unable to comprehend the enormity of his crime. And she thought of all of the small choices that had led to this tragedy. The choice to value money over human life. The choice to remain silent when speaking up might have saved a life. The choice to trust when wariness would have been wiser. "Human nature," she murmured, her needles clicking softly in the gathering dusk. "Always so fascinating, so complex, so capable of both tremendous good and terrible evil. And always, always worth paying attention to." Across the lane, Meadowbrook Cottage stood dark and empty, a silent testament to betrayal and justice, to the price of greed and the cost of truth. Soon it would be sold, its rooms filled with new occupants, its dark history gradually fading into village legend. But for now, it remained. A reminder that even in the most tranquil settings, evil could flourish if good people failed to act. And Miss Marple, ever vigilant, ever observant, would continue to watch, to listen, and to notice the small details that others overlooked. For in a world where nephews could murder aunts for inheritance, where trust could be so cruelly betrayed, someone needed to pay attention. Someone needed to care about justice.